I love Erie. I have sort of a personal connection with Erie in the sense that when I was a young child, my grandparents had a cottage on Lake Erie not far from here, right outside of Fredonia, New York. And I was always very excited to go. And I always remember when I was a child, by the time we got to Erie, the town, I could see Lake Erie, which meant that my vacation was about to begin. It was always very exciting. And then at the end of my week or later on my month with my grandparents, my mom would take me home and I'd look ruefully in the rearview mirror and see Erie and the lake disappear. So I have a very, and I felt that today too, driving into Erie on 79, I could see the lake and I still felt that tinge of excitement. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, everybody. So I've written a book, as you probably guessed by now, on James Madison. And oftentimes the first question I get when I discuss James Madison is, do we really need another book about James Madison? Really? Another one? And that's a fair criticism, I think. There have been a couple books written in the last decade, so just sort of cards on the table. My general view about books on James Madison is this. There's two essential books on James Madison. Now, in case you're wondering, mine is neither of them. But the long, comprehensive book, you can still find it. It's 800 pages. It's enormous. If you finish reading it, you can use it as a doorstop. It was written by Ralph Ketchum all the way back in 1970. That's sort of your go-to book for a thorough, top to bottom, no detail left behind review of James Madison. And then if you want the shorter, quicker beach read, and I don't say that to diminish it, but Rick Brookhiser's book on James Madison is really fantastic. Now, if you're going to write a book and you're not Rick Brookhiser or Ralph Ketchum, you're going to write a book about James Madison, then you really need to have a particular point of view about him. It can't merely be a retelling of the story of his life, because the story has been told successfully really 2 times in the last 50 years. And so I want to introduce to you tonight a little bit about what my idea of Madison is, how we understand Madison, and also why I think it's relevant today. So I would say this. I would say there's probably 4 American founders who I think you could serve as a kind of archetype of traditions within America. I think Alexander Hamilton, probably more than anybody else, among the founders represents the tradition of American capitalism and American economic growth, that sort of creative destruction that we take for granted in American capitalism. Hamilton, among the founders, was not the only advocate of that. Gouverneur Morris was, Robert Morris was, but again, it's sort of the archetype. I would say that George Washington probably represents American nationalism and, by extension, American strength, our ability to, our unity, and from our unity to project our strength against foreign powers. I think we see that with the surrender at Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson, I think, represents the tradition of American liberty. And again, he's not alone on this. You can probably roll off half a dozen other names. You could mention George Mason of Virginia, Samuel Adams, certainly, John Hancock. I mean, is there anything more glorious than John Hancock's signature on the Declaration of Independence? I don't think so. But I think Thomas Jefferson really captured something. In a recent biography of Jefferson by John Boyles, I thought was perfectly titled The Architect of American Liberty. It's very unfortunate for me because I think that Madison really represents, the tradition that Madison represents is the tradition of politics. And it's unfortunate that Boyles had such a perfect title, because I would love to have named my book James Madison, The Architect of American Politics. But alas, I couldn't. Now, at first blush, you might think, oh, darn, it's Monday night, and here I'm going to listen to a lecture about the architect of American politics. It seems like the least engaging, the least romantic of the 4, right? Capitalism, nationalism, liberty, and politics. And even James Madison's personal life has a strange habit of underwhelming in many respects. There's really no great personal tragedies. There are also likewise no great Greek tragedies where Hamilton's arrogance and hubris ultimately leads to his undoing in a duel against the malevolent Aaron Burr. There's nothing like that in Madison's story. But James Madison was very, very good at politics. And in that respect, he serves as a model for what American politics, not what it is right now, but I think what it is supposed to be. And so even as Madison might be the least interesting, or at least the politics might be the least interesting of these four, maybe it's the story that we as Americans right now, perhaps we can derive some use from it, because I think we all probably would agree that our politics is a little dysfunctional. So I want to tell you a little bit about the life of James Madison, the facts, and if you know the story, I hope you won't find it boring, and I promise I'm going to refer back to it at various points in times. But one thing I would point out to you, when I call James Madison America's first politician, I think it's important to bear in mind that from 1776 until 1817, James Madison was almost exclusively a professional politician. That's how he made his living. Now, it wasn't much of a living. And frankly, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did if his father hadn't been a reasonably successful planter. But unlike Thomas Jefferson and unlike George Washington, James Madison did not actually inherit Montpelier until his father died in 1801. So if you ever go to Montpelier, you should bear in mind that that's really more the home of Madison's retirement than the most interesting events in his political life. He would have been going home, and it's remarkable. The author of the Federalist Papers, the advocate for nationalism at the Constitution, going home to his old childhood room with mom and dad. It's humorous to me. Right? But that's what he was. He was a professional politician in an age where men were not supposed to be professional politicians. Politics was a service for which there was, I assure you, very little pay. And most people who were involved in politics, including Jefferson, including Washington, including Gouverneur Morris and Robert Morris, had jobs that were their primary source of income and often required their attention. Madison did not really have anything like that. Madison did not become the owner of a plantation until March of 1801. So let's talk a little bit about his life. So for starters, he was born in 1751 in present-day Orange County, the estate known as Montpelier. And it's difficult for us to appreciate this now, but Montpelier was really sort of on the American frontier at that point in 1751. On the other side, outside of Madison's bedroom, is the Blue Ridge Mountains, and on the other side was the unsettled West. So he was, in many respects, a Westerner. He was very smart as a young boy, and as is often the case for men, or young boys, I should say, of his socioeconomic status that showed promise in learning, he was sent off for private tutors. And then in 1770, he went to Princeton University, which was significant because Princeton University was a Presbyterian school, and it was run by a serious Presbyterian minister by the name of John Witherspoon. And it's there that Madison really encountered in a meaningful way all of the great sources that would become his political philosophy. And he also was imbued with a sort of Calvinist view of human nature. Madison was a very skeptical person when it came to the issue, the prospect of human goodness. And it's hard to trace that directly back to his education. But at the same time, it's hard not to read him without thinking about Witherspoon, or thinking by extension about John Calvin and the notion of human beings being sort of irreparably sinful by nature. So he was very good at school. And unfortunately for him, and unfortunately, it was for my own problem too. I was very good at school, and one of the problems I had was when I graduated, well, what do I do now? He sort of had the same problem. He came home in 1771, 72, and he entered into a bit of a spiritual malaise that was broken by the Boston Tea Party. Madison, like many decent Americans, were outraged by the Boston Tea Party. They thought it was an offense, it undermined the American cause, but what really got him going were the Intolerable Acts. When the Intolerable Acts were enacted, Madison began his lifelong passion with politics. And in 1776, after the Virginians booted the royal governor of New York and established themselves as a self-governing commonwealth, the first thing that every good American state needed to do was write a constitution. And Madison was selected in 1776 to help write the Constitution of Virginia. And he was elected not because he had done anything on his own, he was only 25 years old, but because his father was the wealthiest landowner in Orange County. But nevertheless, Madison distinguished himself a little bit at the Virginia Convention. He contributed meaningfully to the Virginia Declaration of Rights. In particular, if you look at the final article on religious liberty, you'll see it's got a little subtle Madisonian twist there, which sort of anticipates his lifelong friendship with Thomas Jefferson. One of the most interesting results, though, is Madison returned home to the voters and was promptly voted out of office. And the reason why, he lost to a fellow by the name of Charles Porter, who purchased the voters of Orange County whiskey before the election, and so Madison lost. But he had demonstrated capacity, and he was selected to join what was known as the Privy Council, the Advisory Council. Governor Patrick Henry, the first of several times that he would encounter Patrick Henry. Not always friendly, but they seem to have gotten along well. It's also where he encountered Thomas Jefferson. Henry was the first governor of Virginia, and then Jefferson succeeded him. And it was in 1780 that James Madison was selected to go to the Continental Congress as a delegate for Virginia. He had a couple things going for him. The first one, as I mentioned, he was pretty much committed full-time to politics. He didn't have a plantation that he had to run. He didn't have a wife. He didn't have any children. He could commit himself. And frankly, he was a workaholic. Madison probably, I don't want to say he was the hardest working person I've ever encountered in my studies. That honor might go to Hamilton, but Madison is a close second, which is really saying something. Madison also could speak French, which was useful after 1778 when the alliance with the French was forged. But also, frankly, by 1780, the Continental Congress was really not that great a place to be. It wasn't working very well. The sort of the A-list celebrities that you see and the Declaration of Independence, all those A-listers had all mostly gone on to do other things. They were struggling to find people to replace it. Frankly, Congress wasn't working. And that was where Madison develops a true political ideology, which is the idea of nationalism. Madison became convinced that the only way this experiment in self-government was going to work is if the country bound itself together in a stronger union. By the time he left Congress in 1783, he had more or less given up on the Articles of Confederation, which had been governing the country since 1777. Now, he tried to make the Articles of Confederation work. He tried to get a tax passed, and as mentioned a moment ago, that was where the idea of the log roll came through. But it failed. Rhode Island, which was very stubbornly independent and obstreperous all through the 1780s, refused to go along. One state killed the whole thing. And it seemed to Madison like the country was in need of root and branch political reform. So he went home in 1784, and this is a testament to Madison's political skill. Thomas Jefferson had written the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, but it was Madison who got it passed in 1784. By outwitting Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry had opposed the Statute of Religious Freedom, but Madison outmaneuvered him and got it enacted. It was the first time, really, that Madison and Henry would clash. Madison more or less sort of cooled his jets in Virginia politics through the 1780s, waiting for an opportunity, some sort of crisis to reform the government, and that finally comes in 1786. When a handful of farmers in central Massachusetts took up arms against the government in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. And the Shays rebels had some legitimate points. They were being treated unfairly by the Massachusetts government in many respects. But they also were spreading anarchy. And that really scared the living daylights out of the established factions within the country. It's really remarkable. In fact, one of the things to do as a historian is to read the letters that these men wrote one another. It's amazing to see how scared many of them, even George Washington was scared, thought that anarchy was sweeping across New England, that it was going to overtake Massachusetts, and then it was going to spill into New Hampshire, and God knows what happens next. It's an interesting thing about Madison, though, is that he kept his cool. Madison had by that time developed a pretty close professional correspondence with George Washington, which was a delicate thing to do because George Washington was a person remarkable in the sense that it's almost as if George Washington knew that he was George Washington, that he was the first citizen of a republic. He wasn't the king, but he wasn't just some average fella. And he carried himself in that way. And accordingly, people who dealt with Washington, if you wanted success in dealing with Washington, you had to know how to deal with that. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were both very skilled at that. Madison had been trying to get George Washington to sign on to a national conference or convention to reform the Constitution. And Washington had begged him off, said, no, I don't want to go up to Philadelphia. The Brotherhood of the Cincinnati are going to be up there. I'd already told them I'm not going to go. I don't want to go. And frankly, I think the old general had earned his retirement by 1786, 87. But when Washington writes these panicked letters to Madison, Madison says, you know, General, it might be good for you to sign on to this constitutional convention thing. And sure enough, Washington agreed, which immediately, in Madison's words, gave the convention a very solemn dress. See, Madison knew how to talk to Washington in a way that Washington would respond to. That's where the Constitutional Convention comes from. So in May of 1787, we all know the story, 56 men gathered in Philadelphia and hammered out the Constitution. Madison's role in that is, though, really remarkable. And if he had dropped dead on September 17th, 1787, we would still probably be talking about him in many respects, because he does a couple important things. One thing that he does, which is a gift to posterity, is he takes copious notes. The level of detail in Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention are mind-boggling, especially in light of the fact that he wasn't the only person who tried. There were a couple other delegates who tried. Rufus King took notes for a while. I think John Yates took notes, but they all gave up, or their notes are very short, and sometimes they skip things. But Madison must not have done anything except scribble at those meetings, writing everything down. And then he must have gone back to his hostel in the evening and just rewritten everything. Like I said, the amount of work that Madison was prepared to do was just mind-boggling. But the other thing that Madison does is he puts together a plan of government that is also often known as the Virginia Plan, and is the culmination of Madison's experiences over the previous half-decade. The realization that the Articles of Confederation are not working, that this country is not going to work as a compact between 13 free and equal states that retain their sovereignty and, in the language of the Articles of Confederation, enter into a firm league of friendship. Madison realized enough friendship, the only way this is going to work is a union. In other words, we need to get married, so to speak. And that's what his plan of government envisions. It was a national republic. Both chambers of Congress would be elected would be proportional, so the Senate and the House. The more people a state had, the more votes they would have in both. Congress's powers in Madison's plan were not limited. They were not enumerated as they are today in Article 1, Section 8. Instead, they were unlimited. Madison was willing to give Congress the power to do anything that the harmony of the Union depended on it. That's his phrase, harmony of the Union, or the separate states are incompetent. Madison would even have given Congress the power to veto state laws that it believed interfered with the harmony of the Union. So what Madison was really intending on doing at the convention was reducing the states to the position that they had been in under George III, except they would not be subordinated to a distant king, they would be subordinated to the people of the United States as represented in Congress. But as we all know, that's not what ends up happening with the Constitution, right? There's a series of compromises where bit by bit it's chipped away at. The Senate, after 6 weeks of wrangling, the small state delegates, particularly Delaware and New Jersey, insisting that there's no circumstances in which we'll accept proportional representation in both chambers. So finally, they're given the Senate. Likewise, the original Madisonian idea of unlimited power, once it gets through John Rutledge's Committee of Detail, Rutledge is from the South, comes to enumerated powers. Moreover, the Southerners demand all sorts of limits on federal protection for the institution of slavery and the export economy, which it subsidized. And so, by September of 1787, Madison is deeply frustrated. It's very ironic. We think of Madison as the father of the Constitution, which is a title he would never accept, even in old age, but he certainly would not have accepted it in September of 1787. He would have said, I don't want anything to do with this thing. He wrote a series of letters to Thomas Jefferson saying, basically, this isn't going to work. It's not going to answer the needs of the country. It speaks to, talk in a moment about the Federalist Papers, but Madison's most famous Federalist essays, Federalist 10, was written right around the same time that Madison was privately denouncing the Constitution. But as I had mentioned a moment ago, Madison was a man who was, at his core, believed in politics and believed in compromise and believed ultimately in accepting half a loaf. And when in the fall of 1787, Alexander Hamilton proposed the project of writing a series of anonymous essays in defense of the Constitution, Madison signed on. Hamilton wrote the bulk of the essays. There's 85 Federalist essays. I always forget exactly how many Hamilton wrote, but he wrote more than 30. I want to say John Jay wrote about 5, and James Madison wrote about 20. It's really interesting. If you ever have occasion to read them, it's really interesting to read them knowing who wrote which ones. Hamilton's prose and his style of writing is very bold and slashing. Hamilton loves to insult his opponents, his rhetorical opponents. He's always insulting their intelligence or insulting their allegiance to the country. Any decent man of good sense would recognize this criticism as nonsense, but I will take it on anyway. That's sort of Hamilton's prose. Madison, on the other hand, his essays are harder to read. Madison had this bizarre sort of tick. I don't know if it's a tick, but it kind of comes across that way. This intense need to communicate his ideas with precision, so much so that he would often sacrifice rhetorical clarity. So Madison was never really one to turn a phrase because he was so intent on getting his exact meaning across. And I always warn my students when they read Federalist 10, look, you're probably not going to like this the first time you read it. It's kind of a slog. You need to be prepared. There's something to that, but nevertheless, there is the kernel of Madison's basic ideas there, the idea of a national republic, which I'm going to return to when I talk more about what it means to say Madison's the first politician. Right. But ultimately, the Constitution is ratified narrowly. Madison participates in the Virginia ratification debates in the summer of 1788. He hated it. It was hot in the summer. He was sick of Patrick Henry, but ultimately it passes. And so we go into 1789. Madison is serving as a member of the First Congress. And this is the First Congress is one of the most significant in the history of the country. They do a number of extremely important things, many of which Madison is involved in on an immediate level. One thing that he helps do is design the executive departments, the State Department, the Treasury Department in particular. He also writes the first tax bill, the 1789 impost, and I'll talk more about that later. Also, Madison is, I don't want to say he's the author of the Bill of Rights, it's maybe better to say that he's the compiler of the Bill of Rights, which frustrated the opponents of the Constitution to no end, because Madison had opposed a Bill of Rights during the Constitutional Convention, but seemed to have changed his mind. I'll talk more about that later as well. But it was really Madison who took all of the ideas about, well, what are our fundamental liberties, and sort of drilled them down into what really became what we today take to be the first 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights. And Madison also was, in the first Congress, really serving as a kind of de facto prime minister to George Washington. One of the most remarkable things, imagine from Washington's perspective, Washington's elected president of the United States. Well, nowadays we know exactly what that job entails because the job has been in existence for 230 some odd years. But you can imagine Washington going home after he's been inaugurated and say, well, now what do I do? This is an office that doesn't exist. My function is to enforce the laws. Congress has written no laws. What's executive protocol on top of things like that? We turn to Madison for many of those things. One of the most remarkable and to me humorous things is that Madison actually was the primary author of George Washington's inaugural address. Washington had originally given the task to his secretary, but didn't really like the draft, and so gave it to Madison to revise. Well, Madison was happy to oblige him. But Madison also authored the House of Representatives' response to the president's inaugural address, which means that for all intents and purposes, Madison was writing a letter back and forth from and to himself. That's how important he was. And again, if James Madison had dropped dead on September 30th, 1789, at the end of the first session of the first Congress, we would probably still be talking about him. But he lived, and he went on in the 1790s to form a political party in opposition to the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton. Now, why would he do that? Well, Hamilton himself was surprised. Hamilton never really understood what Madison's objections were. But what Madison was really objecting to, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, was Hamilton's seeming favorable attitude towards the rich, to be perfectly honest. But a particular type of rich, the commercial interests, what they would have called the moneyed interests. See, wealth back then, there were different classes of what it meant to be wealthy. George Washington was probably the wealthiest person in the country, but if you asked him for $100, he couldn't give it to you because his wealth was in land, which meant that he was his wealth was constantly enjoined by all of these things that he had to manage on his plantation. On the other hand, people like Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris and Philip Schuyler of New York, their money was primarily in private contracts, private debt contracts, international mercantile agreements, and then the public debt. And Madison's view was that Hamilton's system was too favorable to them, and that Hamilton was actually looking to create a kind of oligarchy, which was the subject of my third book, the fight between Madison and Hamilton, and Madison's belief that Hamilton was trying to create an oligarchy. And what's interesting about this as well is that Madison actually starts fighting Hamilton before Jefferson does. Often we think, whenever we think of these sort of opposing models from the 1790s, we have Hamilton over here and we have Jefferson over there. And indeed, there's no doubt there's truth to that. Because, of course, both Hamilton and Jefferson were in Washington's cabinet and bickering, and both of them were also leaking to the press, denouncing the other, much to Washington's chagrin. So there is something to be said for that. But Madison was actually the first one to join the battle against Hamilton, before Jefferson. As a matter of fact, Jefferson comes later and, by his recollection, brokers a deal in the summer of 1790 between Madison and Hamilton that Jefferson later regretted. But to Madison's point was sort of, I told you he was a problem kind of thing. Well, it wasn't simply a matter in the 1790s we get the rise of party politics and the sort of paranoia that is very common in politics today. We see that in the 1790s. Some of that has to do with the matter of finance, but oftentimes the level of paranoia can creep into politics, both in the United States and in other countries, when foreign entities seem to be entangled. And that was one of the major problems the Americans had, was that the wars of the French Revolution had begun, Great Britain joins the coalition in 1793, and the United States is caught in the middle, on the one hand between Great Britain, which is the country's #1 trading partner, and France, which was its ally, and indeed we had treaty obligations under the 1778 alliance. That ends up splitting the two parties. And importantly, both sides believe that the other are agents of foreign governments. Madison's personal correspondence by the 96, 97, consistently refers to the Federalists as the British Party, right? And also, if you look at George Washington denouncing democratic societies after the Whiskey Rebellion, that's a not so subtle dig at the Jeffersonians being too sympathetic to Jacobin France. This political situation ends up ironing itself out to the satisfaction of Jefferson, who's elected in 1800. Jefferson becomes the third president in 1800, and he names James Madison as his Secretary of State. And if you're looking for my book, does it have a hot take? Not really. I'm not really a hot take type of person. But I do have one semi-hot take, which is that James Madison was actually a pretty gosh darn good president, but he was a terrible Secretary of State. That's about as close as I can get to a hot take in my book. So what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, he gets the Louisiana Purchase, although he doesn't really get it. I mean, Bonaparte just wakes up one day and decides that his brother-in-law Leclerc has died from, Spanish fever, so I'm throwing away my entire empire into the New World, give it to the Americans. So Madison's more the beneficiary of that than anything else. The real problem that Madison and Jefferson failed to deal with successfully is this continuing conflict between Britain and France. After the end of the Revolutionary Wars, they're back at it by 1804. This is really, by the way, towards the end of a 140-year period in which Britain and France had been at war with each other. I mean, you can go all the way back to the 1690s with King William's War and see continual warfare. And the Americans, this had played to their advantage during the Revolutionary War because we got the French to come on up. But now we're stuck in the middle. And particularly now we're stuck between the mighty navy of Horatio Nelson and the unstoppable Grand Army of Bonaparte. And we're stuck in the middle. And both Jefferson and Madison are convinced that the way to extricate ourselves from this dilemma is through a trade war. That's their solution. We're not going to go to war. We'll just not sell our food to the British, and that'll show them. And when I explain this to my students, because I teach high school and you always have to find fun and interesting ways to engage high schoolers, I explain to them the solution is akin to shooting yourself in the foot. That's basically what the Americans did to themselves in 1807 when they established an embargo against trading with Great Britain and France. And ultimately it doesn't work, and the United States has led to war in 1812, which is another reason I have such sympathy for Erie, because of course it is here that Oliver Hazard Perry built the great fleet of Lake Erie and the Lawrence and the Niagara, take down the British fleet, one of the best lines in the entire history of the world. We have met the enemy and he is ours. What a great line. But otherwise, the war was not a very successful war. Ends up sort of being a draw. And I like to think, if you think about the War of 1812 against Great Britain, the way to think about it is maybe at the end of the season, I don't know how many of you are Bills fans, but if you imagine at the end of the season, let's say the Bills are like 15-1, and they're going up against the Steelers, who are at that point 2-14. And the 2-14 Steelers tie the Buffalo Bills. How excited will the Steelers be, right? After that miserable season, they're going to be like, yes, this is amazing. That was sort of America's attitude in the War of 1812. And you actually can get a sense of this. One of my favorite things that in our country, and we do it all the time, is when we sing the national anthem. If you listen to the first verse that we all sing, what is it about? Is it about some great military victory the Americans have won? No, the story is actually the British are bombing Baltimore all night and they don't blow it up. That's the story of the War of 1812. And the Americans, who were very cheeky at the time, took this poem by Francis Scott Key and put it to the tune of a drinking British song. That's what actually it is. It's just a very American, very remarkable thing, right? So Madison is president during this. Madison ends up being handed off the presidency in 1809 from Jefferson. Jefferson goes home and really glad to be out of this morass that he himself had helped create. He gives it to Madison, but we shouldn't feel bad for Madison because he himself was responsible for it as well. But he leads the country successfully through the war. And like I said, it's basically a tie. Really is what it is. I would say it's a tie, but it's a meaningful tie, because the United States of America at that point was an agricultural backwater that none of the European powers really respected. But here, 2 times in a generation, the Americans had managed to stand up to themselves against the British. That's sort of the meaningful nature of the time. And this is how it was celebrated in the country. But people in American politics, people in the know, recognize how lucky we were. And indeed, we were very lucky. If you look at the Battle of Plattsburgh, it is really lucky what we got out in the Battle of Plattsburgh. Likewise, they were really fortunate that the British decided to burn the city of Washington instead of heading straight towards Baltimore. It gave Senator Smith a couple days to fortify the city's defenses. We got really lucky in that war. They knew it deep down, even if they were talking about the bravery of America and all this stuff, they knew they were lucky. So Madison's last great act as a politician, in 1815 and 16, he does a number of things that further complicate his career. He had opposed Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States, but in 1815, he signs the Second Bank of the United States into effect. He had opposed Alexander Hamilton's system of industrial support, but in 1816, he signs the first protective tariff. He'd also been a longtime skeptic of a standing military, but it was Madison in 1815 and 1816 who lays the foundation for the permanent military establishment that we have today. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons the United States Army performed so well in the Mexican-American War was because of many of the reforms that Madison had laid down after the War of 1812. And of course, the Mexican-American War was a training ground for officers such as Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant. And also, Madison eventually and his allies eventually end up adopting internal improvements, building roads, and bridges, and canals. What's interesting about this is that all of these things, a strong central financial system, a strong sort of military establishment, protective tariffs, and internal improvements, end up being the economic agenda of the Republican Party, not the Jeffersonian Republican Party, but the Lincolnian Republicans between 1861, the time that they enter into power, really only ending with the Great Depression in 1933. Now, they do their own things with them, and certainly they make of those things what they are, but it's really interesting that the basics of 19th century American economic policy were established by Madison at the end of his 40-year career. It's also interesting because Abraham Lincoln considered himself a great admirer of Henry Clay, and Henry Clay considered himself a great admirer of James Madison. Okay, so those are the facts of the case. That's the basic script of Madison's political life. So the question is, why is this a story worth learning, committing to memory? Why is this a story that's worth your time tonight? Well, again, think about those four founding fathers that serve as archetypes. Washington as nationalism and strength, Hamilton as capitalism, Jefferson as liberty. I would suggest to you that Madison's idea of politics is a necessary precondition for any of these things to work, particularly the idea of liberty, that you cannot have a free republic unless a republic is well-ordered. And a well-ordered republic requires solving what I like to call the essential problem of government. So what is the essential problem of government? This is something Madison was aware of, and it basically boils down to this. Human beings, all of us, know that the only way that society can work is if we have a system of justice. It's the only way that we can live together and thrive with each other. But we also know that we are not spontaneously capable of creating justice. There are some things we can spontaneously create. If you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he talks all the time about things that we just spontaneously are capable of doing. Justice is not one of those things. We are too selfish by nature. We're too individualistic. This is why we create government. Government provides what we ourselves cannot provide. Government provides justice. But the problem is that government is made up of people as well. So a government that is created to resolve disputes in society and to promote justice can instead become the greatest source of injustice. And it boils down to this simple question: is the government governing on behalf of the citizenry or on behalf of the people in charge? And if you look through most of the history of the world, pretty much every corner of the world, you will see most of the time that the government governs for the benefit of the people in charge. Now, in the United States, a lot of times today, We tend to think that the solution is democracy. That's the solution. That's how we've solved this problem. But that's not really a solution at all. In fact, democracy can be, in many respects, the most dangerous form of government. You can imagine a scenario in which all of us in here are our own little society. Roughly half of everybody on this side, half of everybody on this side. In a democracy, if this side adds up to half plus one, they can take everything from this side of the room and there's nothing to stop them. That's the problem with democracy. It's the problem with any form of government. Yeah, if the people in charge are good and kind and virtuous and wise, it's not a problem. But what if they're selfish? What if they're ignorant? What if they're avaricious? What if they're hateful? This is a problem that exists not only with monarchies, right? The flip side of a monarchy is a tyranny, a monarch being a good king, a tyrant being a bad king. But you can also have bad majorities within the public at large. So the question is, how do we restrain bad majorities and empower good ones, right? That's the question that James Madison confronted in 1787. And the political context that the Americans were in was really extraordinary. It's easy for us to take it for granted today. You need to understand it. Historically speaking, the solution was, how do we stop this from happening? Well, we take a king, we balance it with the landed aristocracy or some sort of class of nobility, and then we have the masses. This is what Great Britain had done with the sovereign, the king, the House of Lords, which would have both the clergy and the landed aristocracy, and the property owners in the form of the people, or the form of the House of Commons. You see, when the Americans couldn't do this for two reasons. First reason is that the British king never bothered to create houses of nobility in the United States of America, right? There's no Duchy of Erie, for instance, right? He never bothered to do anything like that. So when the Americans declared their independence, there was no landed aristocracy. The notion of a landed aristocracy would have been ridiculous because one thing that America had more than it knew what to do with was land, right? I mean, eventually Abraham Lincoln just started handing land out to his electoral coalition, right? That was what the Homestead Act was. We had more land than we knew what to do with. Land was not really a sign of social status or even really all that much wealth. And then we also, not only does the Declaration of Independence overthrow George III, it also says that the only legitimate form of government is government by the people. That's the only legitimate form. So the Americans had inadvertently, in some respects, backed themselves into a corner. They couldn't take advantage of the old European-style solutions to this problem of how do we maintain justice. There was no king, there was no elite, there was no aristocracy, there was only the people. And one of the problems Madison had encountered during his time in the Articles of Confederation was that it wasn't working. The people were in charge, but it was terrible. The government couldn't govern. The Congress was completely incompetent. The states were incompetent and they were unjust. I'd mentioned during my sort of spiel of the history that the Shays rebels, they had some legitimate points. The wealthy had gotten in charge of the state government of Massachusetts and stuck it to the poor farmers in the West. So the question is, well, what do we do? Do we give up? As a matter of fact, it's interesting, fans of Hamilton, and I like Hamilton, don't get me wrong, but I'm a Madison guy. Fans of Hamilton don't like this personal memo that he wrote in 1787 saying, well, worst case scenario, we can always invite the Prince of Wales over to govern us. That could have been one solution. Let's just have a king. The idea of a king being somebody who's above the fray, who can mediate disputes, right? Madison's answer to that is the problem is, what if the king's the problem? What do you do then? Okay. So what's Madison's solution? And this is what I get at when I talk about Madison being America's first politician, not simply being a professional politician, but Madison suggesting that the solution to the essential problem of government is not by empowering a group of nobles, it's not by giving power to a king, it's by organizing democratic politics in a careful, sensible way. Madison and the founders put it this way. They made an empirical bet about democracy, that the larger and broader and more considered a majority was in favor of a given outcome, the more likely that outcome would be fair. So what do I mean by this? Well, imagine a situation, if you will. Consider two pieces of legislation. You don't know what time in our country's history they involve. You don't know what their issues are. All you know are these two sets of facts. One piece of legislation was passed by 75% of both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. The other piece of legislation got the support of 218 members in the House and 51 members in the Senate and was vetoed by the President. Which of these two is more likely to be in the national interest? Not knowing anything else, the answer is pretty clear. It's the former. Now, if you make that bet just one time, don't bet the farm on one bet, right? But if you were to make that bet again and again and again and again, you'd probably do pretty well for yourself. And that's the secret to Madisonian politics. Madison's solution to the essential problem of government was that a precondition for government action in a democracy was the discovery of consensus. That it's not simply half plus one of the country governs half minus one. Instead, majority coalitions in this country have to be broader and bigger and more durable, because it is in those conditions where the government is most likely to be fair, where it is most likely to honor the requirements of respecting individual rights and also promoting the good of the people. So I want to give you some examples just as sort of a final point. That's the basic idea of Madison's political theory, but this also shows up in his political practice. This is something that he actually believed. And there's a few examples to give about this. I want to give you three big examples before I close my talk. Three big examples of where you see James Madison trying to put together a broad, deep, and durable coalition. The conviction that the solution to the essential problem of government in a democratic republic is the search for consensus. So he took this idea seriously. The first one is the Bill of Rights. I'd mentioned this during my talk that Madison had been opposed to the Bill of Rights. He actually had good reasons for being opposed to the Bill of Rights. One thing he pointed out was, look, if the country wants to violate our right to, if the government wants to ignore my right to worship freely, you think a little line in the Constitution's going to stop them? No, he called these parchment barriers. They're not going to work. It's a pretty fair point. I mean, if you look at the way the country sort of gleefully suppressed free speech during World War I, it's really kind of remarkable how we can just ignore fundamental liberties when we're all ginned up about something, right? But nevertheless, Madison agreed not just to support Bill of Rights, but to push for it. And he really did have to push for it, because the Congress that was elected in 1789 didn't really want to do Bill of Rights. I remember when I was researching my book, I was expecting some grand, illuminating debate in Congress between the members of the House of Representatives on the nature of our individual liberties. Instead, the historical record time and again sees members of Congress going, why do we have to talk about this? We still have to do the courts, Madison hectored them into doing the Bill of Rights. And his reason was, look, this was the deal that we made. This is how we got 11 of the 13 states to sign on to this government. They're expecting us to deliver on this. Even though he didn't think it would do a lot of good, he still thought it was important. It was a sign of good faith among people who had negotiated a compromise. Another thing, the final two I'll mention, but I could talk more about these. His strange relationship with Alexander Hamilton. In the 1790s, he was opposed to Hamilton's economic policies, but in the 18-teens, he supported it. A lot of people, a lot of Madison scholars, certainly a lot of Hamilton scholars have suggested that this suggests a weak-mindedness on Madison's part, that he was deep down a nationalist, but he was under the spell of Thomas Jefferson. I assure you he wasn't. He was always his own man. It doesn't make any sense, people think, except the difference is, if you appreciate Hamilton's economic policies in the 1790s, They were overwhelmingly favorable to what Madison would have called the moneyed interest. And the moneyed interest were basically people who'd owned bills of credit and specifically government debt. These people were concentrated in the cities, in New York and Philadelphia and Boston. Hamilton's economic program generated windfall profits to these groups of people. Now, Hamilton had his reasons for doing this. He thought it would be good for the country. But Hamilton also thought it was important to give these people a special seat at the table. That the moneyed interest in this country would make or break the success of the country, and that Hamilton had to give them the sense that betting on America was a win for them. Almost like a put, if you've ever heard of a put in Wall Street. That's kind of what Hamilton was trying to set up for the rich. See, this violated Madison's essential notion of fair play in a republic. Policy benefits in a republic, if it's built on consensus, the policy benefits should be distributed broadly among multiple factions in society, regardless of how much money they have. If you're a citizen and you can vote, then you should be able to bid for policy benefits. And Madison was especially upset at his belief, which I think was a correct one, that Hamilton was looking to place these people permanently in a seat of political power. But after George Washington died, Hamilton was pretty clear what his intentions were, particularly when he got himself named second in command of the army during the Quasi-War with France. Hamilton was looking to entrench a certain class of what he might call natural aristocrats in government, independent of public oversight. This Madison could not abide. And the apparent contradiction in Madison really has more to do not so much with the economic factors, but instead with how Hamilton wanted to reorganize political power. But then in the 18-teens, a decade after Hamilton had died, Madison adopted much of Hamilton's program. But he did so in an interesting way. If you look at Madison's economic program after the War of 1812, what you see is the outlines of what Henry Clay would call the American system. The basic contours were this. The Bank of the United States would be good for the merchants, but internal improvements would be good for farmers. And also, on top of that, protective tariffs would be good for manufacturers and could also be made to work for farmers. So what you see Madison doing in the 18-teens is, yes, he's taking Hamiltonian ideas, but he's creating within them a broader political coalition that encapsulates a large majority of the country. And after Madison retired, it's sort of interesting and ironic, I suppose, that Madison needs a little bit of rehabilitation these days. Although I think his reputation really probably turned around with Lynn Cheney's very, very fine biography of him. But it is interesting that was sort of required. But it wasn't required in 1817. When Madison retired from politics in 1817, he was widely celebrated as a great man, a great leader, and was succeeded by James Monroe in a period of time that history has remembered as the era of good feelings, right? James Monroe was president during the era of good feelings. And historians nowadays like to poo-poo the era of good feelings, like it wasn't that long of an era and the feelings weren't that. Actually, it was actually pretty impressive. James Monroe was elected without any political opposition in 1820. It's pretty remarkable. And in 1816, he succeeded Madison with virtually no opposition at all, which is really a testament, I think, in many respects, to Madisonian politics. This idea of building out a political coalition that is large enough, that takes in a large enough portion of the country that's greater than half plus one, and that is actually in the public interest, so much so that presidential elections aren't what they are today. And I think Madison deserves some credit for that. And I guess as a final point, I would just offer a contrast. Madison's vision of politics is simply this. Madison's vision of politics is the process by which different groups of people with different preferences, different beliefs, different interests, bargain with each other and search for common ground. That's what politics is in Madison's thinking. And that is so much different than our politics today. We have an election coming up tomorrow, And I'll tell you this, I don't know which side you're in favor of, but I know there's a lot of fear in this country that their side's going to lose. My side is going to lose, and the other side, what are they going to do as soon as they get in charge? They're going to destroy my side. That's the constant fear in this country. Like, politics in America is just a question of whether or not Democrats can amass enough power to destroy the Republican Party, or Republicans can do likewise to the Democratic Party. And that's why I think, even though of the four archetypes that I mentioned, Hamilton, Washington, and Madison, Madison is really maybe the one we need to hear most from right now. Because politics doesn't have to be half plus one, zero-sum game. I get everything, you get nothing, two parties. I like to contrast Madison with Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, after Roosevelt was planning to bolt and start his third party, he talked to his supporters and he said, "We stand at Armageddon and we do battle for the Lord." And that's the way politics today often seems. And Madison's response would be, no, that's not what politics is supposed to be at all. Politics should be the process by which we figure out what we have in common with each other, and we do that thing. It is not the process by which we destroy each other. It's not supposed to be a process where we identify and exacerbate our differences. It's supposed to be the process by which we find our similarities and our commonalities. This is how we can solve that essential problem of government, because the chances are, if most of us agree on a certain course of action, that's probably the right thing to do. And that's how Republican government was supposed to work in this country. I don't think it is how it works now, but hopefully it will someday. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jay Cost, thank you, thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, how about another round of applause for learning about Madison tonight from Dr. Jay Cost.
Thank you very much.
So Jay, welcome back to Erie, Pennsylvania. It has been a long 5 years. A few things have happened since we've last had you, and maybe we'll get into some of those, but you've written on Madison before. You could write about any of the founders, any of the presidents. What keeps drawing Jay Cost back to James Madison?
Well, I guess the glib answer would be Madison was short and nerdy, and I am short and nerdy.
So one of the audience questions, which I already have some, and this is a reminder that we are taking those, so if you have your question, make sure you get it to one of our team members. One of the questions is literally, was he the shortest president?
Oh, yes.
By how much?
Not a lot.
Okay.
He was 5'4". Benjamin Harrison was 5'6". But maybe the most remarkable thing about Madison was he only weighed 100 pounds. So if you saw him, you would be like, what is that little boy doing in the White House, is what he would look like. As a matter of fact, if you go to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, on the second floor, they have these, I don't know if they're bronze, but they look bronze statues, life-size statues of all of the founders at the convention. And Madison is standing, the Madison statue is standing next to the Washington statue. I couldn't believe it the first time I saw it.
So how did he not suffer from the Napoleonic complex?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that Madison, Bonaparte had other problems. Bonaparte was the son of an impoverished, Corsican aristocrat. Madison had, Madison came from a middling family in the Virginia aristocracy. And also, I think the other thing is Madison just had no appetite for war. I mean, he really, it's very ironic that Madison was the first wartime president, because he truly detested war.
So you started your talk with, there are plenty of books about Madison, and this is an excellent one. And again, a reminder, we have the sale and signing happening right after our talk here. This is an excellent one, well-researched, very thoughtful. What surprised, so I'm surprised that he weighed 100 pounds. What surprised you in your research when you were looking at Madison anew, thinking, yes, I'm going to add another volume to the canon, looking at Madison? What surprised you the most?
Well, the agenda that I had when I was writing the book was to reconcile the Madison of the Federalist Papers with his political life and political practice. That was sort of the talk of my speech tonight. I think this sort of little things that surprised me, I think maybe the most extraordinary thing that surprised me when I was researching Madison was when he was in Congress in, I want to say 1782. He fell in love with a girl. She was 15 years old, which is young by today's standards, but would have been within the reasonable boundaries of back then. She was 15 years old, and he was going to marry her, and they had agreed to get married. And Madison had written a letter to Jefferson, but then Kitty Floyd dumped him. And what's really interesting, that's interesting, but I knew that. But what I found was really interesting was that in retirement, after Jefferson had died, Madison had gotten his old letters to Jefferson back and had taken the section of the letter he wrote to Jefferson about being dumped by Kitty Floyd and crossed it out. And it was only through, the technologies of the current era that we were able to figure out what he'd actually written. And I think that one of the lessons with that was Madison had a very long retirement. And as a consequence of that, he was able to curate his papers to a remarkable degree. Jefferson was as well. Now, I think Madison was in the main honest, but I think Madison also was intent upon making sure that we had access to his public life, but not his private life. Very few letters between Madison and Dolly survive.
And I find that interesting, maybe the modern day equivalent of deleting your Twitter thread and doing some editing. And I'd love to know what Madison would think about things like Twitter today. But this person from the audience is wondering, what would he say about today's electoral college?
Well, it depends on when you ask him. In 1787, he would have hated the electoral college. In 1780, because the Electoral College ported over the Senate from because electors are allocated based upon the total congressional delegation between the House and the Senate. And so states like Delaware would get 3 electors even though they don't have the equivalent population. So in that regard, he would not have liked it. I think, though, that Madison is unique among the founders who were long-lived, Adams and Jefferson particularly, where by the end of Madison's life, he was reasonably optimistic about the American experiment in self-government, and I think he felt that the issues on which he thought he had been in error, that they had turned out reasonably well. What he would say about the Electoral College today would be inevitably bound up in his view of American politics today, and that I can only speculate about. But I would say that Madison had, by the end of his life, evolved a respect for and even admiration for those parts of the Constitution that he had originally opposed.
I think one of the things that I appreciate about Madison is his ability to evolve and change his mind over time. And I think maybe that's one of the things that can be frustrating about today's politics. And we'll get into today's politics in the context of Madison, but if we can take a break from Madison for a minute, this person in the audience is curious who your favorite modern day president is and why.
I really like Gerald Ford. And it's not just because AEI gave me a title with Gerald Ford's name in it. I mean, maybe that's part of it, I don't know. But I like Gerald Ford a lot. I think that if Gerald Ford had hung Richard Nixon out to dry, he could have been easily elected president in his own right in 1976. And I think more importantly, when Nixon left in August of 1974, Ford could have guessed that hanging Nixon out to dry would have helped him win re-election. And he didn't do it because he wanted to spare the country. And I think that Ford was right to do that. I think he did the country a service. And the notion of sacrificing your own political service or your own political future to do the country a service, I think is very admirable. So I tend to really admire Gerald Ford for that.
And not just because your title's named.
No, I mean, that's certainly part of it.
But it's fitting.
Right.
It's fitting. So let's go back to Madison. That's who we're focused on tonight. This person has a very specific question in Federalist 10. Madison says, enlightened statesmen will not beat the helm that seems prophetic in today's politics. Have we failed Madison with today's politics?
I would say no. I think that Federalist 10 is a story about, and Madison's general political philosophy is a story about how to deal with a politics where there is an absence of virtue. Now, I think that ultimately you need, and I think Madison would agree, that there has to be some quantum of virtue, right? But otherwise, if all we want to do is destroy each other, then there's no constitution that's going to stop us from doing that. But what Madison was getting at there is that it's easy to talk about the great kings of Europe or the great emperors of Rome. But what happens, how does a state sustain itself over time when you don't have these great, natural sort of aristocrats, to borrow a phrase from the period? What do you do then? How do you govern a society then? And I think, I know that people nowadays find the gridlock in Washington, D.C. very discouraging. And I know that people find the vitriol of Washington, D.C. very discouraging as well. I do too. But I think that one of the blessings that we need to appreciate about our system is that when there is not a consensus, our government tends to devolve into gridlock. That gridlock is the alternative that our government has over and above putting one side in charge. And I think that that's a good thing. And I think that one of the problems we have today, I think, is not so much the existence of gridlock. I think one of our major problems today is that too many people see politics and act in politics in ways that are consistent with Teddy Roosevelt's vision in that speech. Not that that was Roosevelt's vision, but Roosevelt's rhetoric in that speech is that too many people on the right hate the left, and too many people on the left hate the right. And so even on points of potential compromise, the two sides hate each other so much that they're not going to do anything about it. I think that, to me, is the bigger problem more than anything else today.
And I think it's a good reminder that this is a problem that we've been wrestling with as a country for a while and continue to wrestle with. And I think we'll get to some of the what ifs and how do we move forward from that. This person's asking a really tough question that we wrestle with the founders. I think that in ways we've deified them, in ways we've made them mythical figures in our American tapestry. What do we do with Madison and slavery, and opening the question to other founders in slavery, having this conversation?
Yes, that is a good question, and it is a good point. We have deified them. I think particularly conservatives have tended to deify them, and I think that has prompted a response from the left in attacking them, in throwing out the good with the bad. And I think that the answer to the question about slavery is that they knew that slavery was wrong, and they didn't do anything about it. That is just, I think, is the truth. And I don't think that is, I'll say this as well. I think there was a moment in America during the revolutionary fervor and this idea, the development, and you see this in Jefferson's Declaration, there was this realization among Americans that what Jefferson said about individual rights was true. And this was a new idea in the sense that it had never really been an idea that was popular with the mass public ever in the history of the world up until that point in time. And so for most of the history of the world up until that point in time, people were not equal, and most civilizations had slavery. But the Americans, they inherited slavery and realized it was wrong. Jefferson was not an idiot. Madison was not an idiot. They knew what they were saying in the Declaration of Independence about all men being created equal. George Mason at the Constitutional Convention called slavery the curse of heaven, is what he called it. They didn't do anything about it. And I think that we need to, we as Americans today must be mindful not to turn these men into demigods. We need to take from them the ideas that are useful, and we need to discard from them prejudices that they should have done better on that.
And I think that it's apt to remind, like, they're human. He goes back and edits out letters. We cannot put them on pedestals that leads us to worshiping false idols in a false way, I suppose.
Right. But I think we can go farther than that, though. And I think we really have to acknowledge that the great moral failure of the framers, that this was not merely they were human and they screwed up. They knew that this was wrong. They knew that it was wrong. They knew that it was evil, and they knew that they were hypocrites. And their solution was, it'll work itself out. So, like, for instance, when Lincoln, in the second inaugural address, frames the Civil War as God repaying the United States for this sin, like, they could have intuited that, I think. One of the last things that Madison, the last public thing that he wrote was, he called it a letter to my country, or an address. I think that's what it was called. But it was, because he died in 1836. So he lived long enough to see the nullification crisis. And he lived long enough to see the prospects of disunion. And he compared disunion to the serpent in the garden. But, you don't have to dig too deep into the nullification crisis to know that the reason that there was disunion afoot was because South Carolina and Virginia especially were becoming different from the rest of the country, and that nullification was actually about slavery. And I think most of them knew that there was something about slavery that was like the serpent in the garden. And so I think in that regard, we have to be more critical of them than, say, people from other places and times who didn't believe that men were truly created equal and slavery was just part of their lives. In other words, somebody who writes the Declaration of Independence should have known better. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison said that what he called the mere distinction of color is no basis to enslave one group of people upon another, and yet he continued to do that. You say something like that, you know better, and you should do better. And I think it's okay. I say this as a conservative, and I say this as an overall fan of James Madison. The last chapter of my book, I'm very critical of him.
And it's a really great chapter, it's a really great book, and I'm not just saying that because we have the sale and signing of this, but what you've just said is really powerful. Why are not more conservatives, more liberals, more people just saying that?
I'm not sure. I think there's been an evolution I think one of the problems has long been in the historiography is that there's a tendency to say things to the effect of, well, he was a good slave owner. He didn't abuse his slaves. He didn't sell them off. He didn't break up families. He was nice, things like that. And I think that the failure there is to hold them up. I guess the issue is this, is that they failed to live up to their ideals and their standards. Too many people on the right are prepared to just ignore that or talk around it. Too many people on the left are prepared to say, okay, well, therefore the ideals, the standards, the notions of self-governance, the constitutional vision of consensus, all of these things are tainted. And to say that it's too much on one side and it's not nearly enough on the other.
I think you were giving us a good dose of optimism from history at the end of your presentation. And I think that fits really well with one of our audience questions here of what would Madison have to say to the many people who have lost faith in America's core institution, elections, the Supreme Court, Congress, etc. If we could bring him back for a day, have him survey the field, what does he say?
I don't know. I don't know. He was, I mean, I can tell you what I think, but I'm hesitant. I don't want to put words in his mouth because he was a lot smarter than I am, and I sort of think that if he did come back, I would be like really surprised. Wow, I wasn't expecting that. I don't know what he would say. I think one thing I can say that I do believe. That I think he would tell us that we treat politics like it's religion, and it shouldn't be. Religion is supposed to be religion. Politics is supposed to be the search for common ground, I would say. Now, what that means in terms of the multiple issues and problems that we have today, I mean, because they're all sort of interconnected, you know, polarization in Congress and campaign finance and a Supreme Court. I will say this, one thing I can say without equivocation, James Madison would hate the United States Supreme Court. I will say that without equivocation. He would hate this Supreme Court. He would find fundamentally offensive the idea that 5 individuals can make decisions for an entire country of 330 million people. He would hate that.
So you took the answer to the question right out of my mouth for the next one, because I was going to say we're switching branches for a minute and ask about the Supreme Court, because we had several questions from the audience about that. So I will do what any good moderator does and switch right back to the executive branch and focus on that to say, so we have John Dickerson coming in later in this round of the summit, and he's talking about his book, The Hardest Job in the World. And so obviously the executive branch has grown and we have grown it. What would Madison say about the size of the executive branch, the roles, the responsibility, the consoler-in-chief role these days, the might that we heap upon the executive branch? How would he evaluate it?
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't know either. I'm sorry to disappoint. I mean, it's just challenging because, you know, the way the executive branch has changed over the generations, I mean, it's remarkable. You know, Madison basically served as his own Secretary of State. He didn't like, Robert Smith was his Secretary of State. He didn't like Robert Smith. He didn't trust him. And so he just basically did the work himself. And frankly, the executive branch of the government back then was really just a handful of gentlemen and then, you know, maybe 24 clerks, with the exception of the Treasury Department, which would have tax offices. So I guess ultimately, and maybe this is one of the challenges with somebody like Madison, is that Madison, I'm not sure that he is of much use for us in terms of diagnosing specific problems with our government. Because the specific problems that we have are decidedly modern problems, or maybe I should say 20th. Maybe the better way to put it is post-war problems, post-World War II. The rise of the modern administrative state, the rise of the sort of mass media and things like that. None of these things are within Madison's sphere of cognizance. Madison doesn't even really live through the Industrial Revolution, even the beginning of it, really. So he dies in 1837. So he never even rode on a train, right? So his value for us understanding the nature of our problems today is limited, and I think that we need to, I think that Madison's greatest use for us is on orienting our minds about the nature of Republican government. What is it supposed to entail? What is it not supposed to entail? Solving specific problems that we have today, I'm not sure that he's a lot of use for us.
So almost out of time, and so I have two final questions before we conclude the talk here. One is personal, one will be for the public as we head into the night. The personal one is I can't help, as a guy with the first name Ben, noticing the founders you've mentioned and the roles they play. We've got Hamilton, we've got Jefferson, we've got Washington, we have Madison. When can we work Benjamin Franklin into this mix here as maybe America's innovator, as the chief architect of something? That's my personal question.
Well, that is a good question. I mean, I guess one of the problems that Franklin had is that he died in 1790.
He's pretty old at
he
the
was
time
pretty
all this
he
is
was
happening.
very long lived at that point. I think that maybe Franklin might be the first American in some respects, that he was a uniquely American creation. I mean, I just think of Franklin going off and charming the court of Louis in France with his coonskin cap and making himself seem like a backwater ignoramus, but all the while very carefully threading the needle to create the Franco-American alliance. There's something uniquely American, like at first you want to laugh at an American, but then when you look a little closely, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I just ate at McDonald's kind of thing, like, something like that.
So when you write Benjamin Franklin First American, we'll have you back to talk about that
I'll
book
look
here
forward to that.
for this, and I'm here to help if you need. So the final question that I want to ask is because, again, so many of these questions, I think folks are worried, and not just because it's the eve of midterm elections, but we're worried about today's fractured politics, how we heal the nation, what we can do, and so the question that I want to ask you is we've talked a lot of what ifs. If we could bring Madison back, what would he say today? Maybe let's look back to what we have from Madison. So if you're so you are a doctor, if you're a medical doctor for a second, and we look at a wounded country, we have things that ail us. If you were to prescribe reading, aside from your book, if you were to prescribe us reading, politicians, what would you prescribe them to read from Madison? The electorate, what would you prescribe for them to read of Madison?
That's a good question. I mean, Madison. I guess one of the problems is that Madison is not an easy read, right? And I don't mean that he could have been a better writer. What I really like about him, if I would encourage people to read anything, I guess in just a complete hypothetical, one of the things I was really struck by when I was doing research for the book was Madison's work on the impost of 1789. So this would have been the first the first national tax enacted by Congress. And it was going to be a tax on imported goods. And very quickly it devolves into every region trying to get every scrap that they can get for themselves, right? So the New Englanders, because they make rum, they want to have molasses imported cheap. The Westerners, because it's hard for them to acquire foodstuffs, they want salt cheap, right? And so it could have devolved into this everybody just piling on to everybody else. But Madison is very careful during those debates to try and keep everybody like, no, you got this thing, and you're asking too much here, and you need something over here. Like, we need to figure out a way for all of us to get something, right? And then in the process of all of us getting something, more importantly, in that case, we got a tax. And so we were able to finance the debt, which is what saved the country from disaster. And I think, not to beat a dead horse, but that I think is what we're missing from politics today, is the belief on both sides of the aisle, not just that it's a zero-sum game, but that it's Armageddon, right? And both sides act like it's Armageddon. And I think that that's not how we should think. I mean, I'm just tired of it, to be honest. I don't want to live in a country where, like, every 2 years we're all freaked out that this is going to be the end of our country. I just think we just need to be nicer to each other and find common ground and learn that it's okay. Like, I'll put it this way. We have competing views on what the public good is. We have competing values. We have competing interests. We have competing and differing views about God and about the nature of rights and things like that. We're just always going to disagree. You know, politics, instead of like one group triumphing its values over everybody else's, it's instead about finding the places where our values actually correspond and we can work together. And I feel like too much of our politics now is the exact opposite of that. And I think that Washington, D.C., politicians in Washington, D.C., are increasingly keying off of the voters. Like, this is how particularly the people who are most actively involved in politics, and I see this on Twitter, I think maybe at Twitter I noticed this, is that the people who are most engaged in politics and they donate, they, you know, all that stuff, they're the ones who are most likely to see politics as the battle of Armageddon. And I think we just got to stop doing that.
I think that's a powerful, thoughtful, poignant, moving note to conclude tonight on the eve of midterm. Before I ask you for a round of applause for the fantastic lecture and insightful discussion with Dr. Jay Costa, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. The Global Summit does not happen without you being here and being a part of this civic dialogue. So a big thanks to you. I think that's what we can do, carry it into the night to work to find common ground with those that we may disagree with. We can do so disagreeably. And of course, we're going to invite you right back here. We're going to take off tomorrow for Election Day. So if you've not already done, vote, vote, vote. Practice democracy tomorrow. And then we'll see you back here Wednesday, not here physically. We're headed down to Gannon University for John Austin and an international panel of experts joining us, talking about rejuvenating the heartlands and how that ripples up to our neck of the woods in the Rust Belt. And then on Thursday, we're taking a look at how towns are writing the future of the country, looking at community development initiatives that our towns will shine a light on. And then we're right back here, literally here in this very room Friday night to learn from our very own Reverend Charles Brock. But Dr. Jay Costa, thank you, thank you, thank you.